The M1 Carbine Wartime Production by Craig Reisch, which is now in its 7th updated edition, provides all the information you need to determine not only the authenticity of an M1 carbine, but that each and every part is correct for its period of manufacture. The M1 carbine is one of the most collectible of all American military weapons of World War II and the Korean War. All 6,200,000 U.S. M1 and M2 carbines were manufactured between 1942 and 1945, and none after. Currently, prices range from $500 to $3,000 and more. The more original the carbine, the higher the price. How do you know that a particular carbine is correct as it came from the factory? Craig Reisch's M1 Carbine Wartime Production Book has sold more than 31,000 copies. Each of the 7 editions has been updated with new information resulting from years of continuing research. Each part of the carbine is described and illustrated. Unique parts markings by each of the 10 manufacturers are listed by serial number range. The receiver shown here in 3 views is the heart of any firearm. It holds the trigger and magazine assembly, the rear sight, and the stock. When determining the authenticity and originality of an M1 carbine, you must start with the receiver. All carbine receivers were marked on the front of the receiver, U.S. carbine caliber 30 M1 or M2 in 2 lines. The carbine receivers were marked on the rear apron with the manufacturer's name and serial number. 10 companies manufactured the M1 carbine during World War II, but 22 variations of those manufacturers' names can appear on an M1 carbine receiver. For example, 7 companies acquired receivers from other manufacturers at various times to avoid production slowdowns. These receivers will have a different name, like this Union switch and signal receiver, which was furnished to quality hardware and marked unquality. Others may have the original manufacturer's name lined through and the name or initials of the company using the receiver stamped below or on the right side of the receiver. If an M1 carbine has a serial number marked ahead of the rear sight, it was stamped there when an adjustable rear sight was installed during repair or rebuilding if it covered the serial number on the rear of the receiver enough to make it unreadable. A total of 21 contracts were issued to the 10 manufacturers to build M1 carbines, but as an example of how confusing manufacturers' markings and serial number ranges can be, one manufacturer, Irwin Pedersen, never produced a completed carbine accepted by the Ordnance Department. Its contract was taken over by Saginaw Steering Gear, a division of General Motors. Irwin Pedersen marked receivers were used by Saginaw Steering Gear until they were used up. If original, parts on these carbines will be code marked with the initials IP or SG. During World War II, there were 2 Saginaw Steering Gear divisions of General Motors, Saginaw Steering Gear of Saginaw, Michigan, and Saginaw Steering Gear of Grand Rapids, Michigan. The 2 factories should not be confused. Saginaw Steering Gear of Saginaw code-marked their parts SG. The Grand Rapids plant code-marked their parts IP and later S''G', pronounced S''G'. 2 types of receivers were manufactured for the M1 carbine. The Type 1 receiver had an operating spring guide that could be detached from the right side of the receiver for servicing. The spring guide was made in 3 variations, one of which is very rare and adds a premium to the value of an M1 carbine. We'll find the 3 types and other parts described in detail in the M1 Carbine Wartime Production Book. The Type 2 receiver is the most common and were made by all manufacturers except Quality Control. Instead of a detachable spring guide, a deep hole was bored in the right side of the receiver to accept the spring and guide. Quality hardware receivers are all Type 1. Winchester and Rockola receivers to mid-1943 are also Type 1. All other carbine receivers were Type 2, except the very earliest Inland receivers, and Inland did use the operating spring guide to salvage receivers damaged during the drilling operation in mid-1943. 3 types of rear sights were installed on the M1 Carbine during World War II and after. Until mid-1944, all rear sights were the flip type, sighted for 150 and 300 yards. Original flip sights were parkerized. All were marked S on the left side. The sight was inserted into the dovetail from the right so that the S showed on the left. Collectors should be very careful. Aftermarket flip sights have long been reproduced. Look for too sharp corners or poor fit in the dovetail. 2 types of adjustable rear sights were installed on the M1 Carbine. The base of the Type 2 was milled from a bar of steel and installed on some Inland-made carbines beginning in mid-1944. These sights were marked PI. Not enough Type 2 rear sights could be made before the war ended, and the Type 1 flip sight continued to be installed on new M1 carbines to the end of production in 1944-45. The Type 3 rear sight base was made of stamped steel and is easily distinguished from the Type 2. It had a larger windage knob and a sighting notch. It appeared very late in the war and was used primarily as a replacement until M1 and M2 carbines were withdrawn from service. When an M1 carbine underwent refurbishment or rebuilding after the war ended in 1945, the Type 2 or 3 sight was installed no matter when the carbine was manufactured or by what company. The Type 3 rear sight was also installed on all M2 carbines. Because the value, both historical and economical, is greater for an M1 carbine that has not been altered in any way, collectors should examine the following 5 illustrations carefully. All are explained in detail in the U.S. M1 Carbine's Wartime Production Book. During the 1950s and early 1960s, many M1 carbines were declared surplus by the military and demilled by cutting the receiver in half with a saw or a cutting torch. The parts were then sold as scrap steel. Several small companies acquired these demilled receivers and matched, trimmed, and welded front and rear parts together and refinished them. Look for a light or dark line 1/4 of an inch to 1/2 an inch wide in the middle of the rails and sides of the receiver. Also look for pits or rough machining in the welded area. These carbines should never be fired. Many carbines made to mid-1944 with a flip sight will not have the rear sight staked in place so that they could be adjusted for windage later on, but they may show a fine line scribed or punched into the front apron of the rear sight and the receiver as an index mark. If you see a stake mark with a flip sight, it has been replaced outside of military service. M1 carbines, either manufactured originally with adjustable rear sights or with the sights installed during a rebuilding process, will show stake marks on the right side of the dovetail, front and rear. This was done to hold the rear sight securely in place as windage was adjusted internally with the windage knob. All M1 and M2 carbines were parkerized. The receiver was lightly sandblasted to allow the finish to adhere. Original receivers and other parts will show light machine marks, and letters and numbers stamped into the metal will be sharp and crisp. Refinished receivers will have been sandblasted a second or even third time prior to reparkerizing. Machining marks were largely obliterated, and letters and numbers will be eroded and even unreadable. At least 15 companies manufactured copies of the M1 carbine after World War II. None of these carbines were ever acquired by the U.S. military. If an M1 carbine receiver has any of the names listed, it is an aftermarket, non-military commercial carbine. In short, it is a reproduction. These are just a few of the important points to use in identifying and authenticating an original M1 carbine. It would take several hours to describe all the factors that make up an original carbine, but they are thoroughly described in the U.S. M1 Carbines Wartime Production Book by Craig Reish, available from North Cape Publications Incorporated or Amazon.com.